All right. We know enough about where we're going to just, we wing it anyway. So.
We do.
Yeah, let's just be honest.
Pirates.
We wing it and hope you carry us. So
Pretty much.
It's a good thing I'm a strong woman.
that's right.
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot Van Hoy,
and Natalie Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, one and all, to Studio 1715 and the Cross Connections podcast.
It's looking more and more like a real thing. We have an actual table
Yeah,
we're on now, so we're getting there.
we're moving along here in our new space. It's working out pretty well so
It is.
far. Yeah. So we are here today with episode 49 of season 2 of Cross Connections, going through the Bible from cover to cover, and we have made it into what do we call them? The little prophets, or the minor prophets.
The minor prophets.
Yes, we're
Not that their message is minor, because they're mighty,
big messages.
big messages. They're just small books. We call the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, a little bit in between. But when we have these little tiny books,
Yep.
minor prophets.
Right.
Short books, big messages. We've got 5 of them for you today. We are going to hit on Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, and Nahum, but we're not going to do them in that order.
No.
That is the order that they probably are in your Bible, but for the sake of our conversation, we've decided to reorganize our conversation.
This will
around
become a theme.
where they make most sense.
Because as we go from here into the New Testament, the books are just shorter than the Old Testament, long books. And so we're going to have a lot of episodes that are on multiple books. And we're going to have to move them around a little bit on the podcast just so that they can work out thematically.
Yeah. So apologies if you're reading directly and somehow we get a little off when we get into the New Testament. But for right now, your reading should be fairly close to on where we are in the minor prophets. We will have one more episode on minor prophets next week, which will finish us up on episodes in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Episode 50 will be our last Old Testament episode.
And we know, I'm not sure we said this on the podcast yet, but I know there's lots of people that have said, I fell off on the reading. The summer came, went on vacation, or something happened, I fell off, but I'm still listening to the podcast, and that's awesome. It's great. We're glad you're still a cross connector. But when we start the New Testament, you feel free to declare bankruptcy and just hop on to the New Testament. And
There's a new train coming around.
that's right. And so even if you didn't read the Bible cover to cover, you can still say that you read the New Testament cover to cover, and that it still counts.
Yeah, maybe we'll rerun our gospel episodes or repoint you to our gospel episodes again and get you ready for moving into Acts, the end of this
Excellent.
month being October 2025, if you're not listening as we release.
Yes. Cool.
Great. All right, so I believe we're starting with Micah today and Amos.
Yeah, Micah and Amos. I think they both pair well together. They are prophets of Judah, though Amos's message, and part of what makes him a little bit unique, is he was from southern Judah, but prophesied to the northern kingdom. So again, we've been jumping all over the timeline here in our Old Testament readings, but the prophet Amos was in the late 8th century, maybe early 7th century. So the book begins by saying he was a shepherd of Tekoa, and he prophesied in the days of King Uzziah of Judah and King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. And interestingly enough, 2 years before the earthquake.
Before the earthquake. What earthquake?
Yeah, what earthquake?
I know.
Archaeologically, though, we do think there was a major earthquake. How they know this? Don't ask me. Around 760.
Wow.
So that places this writing.
Oh.
And that corresponds with these
the
kings.
timeline.
Yeah,
Okay.
these kings in this timeline. One note about Amos's context in particular is that I'm sure our cross connectors combed through the book of Kings, and they remember this Jeroboam of Israel that Amos prophesied under. And what they may remember is Kings records that under Jeroboam II, Israel's borders were expanded significantly, and his reign was fairly long. So Amos was a time of great prosperity. And that comes across in the message of the book, right?
Yeah.
He has quite a bit to say about the cows of Bashan.
Yeah, and there's economic prosperity, and that brings its own problems.
Right.
It's not just, oh, we have economic prosperity, perfect, everything's going to go wonderfully. No, it has its own problems.
Right.
Yeah. It starts out with a series of prophecies against other nations, and I'm not the only one who thinks this. But as you read through, first we prophesy against Damascus, and then Gaza, and then Tyre, and then Edom, and then Ammon, and then Moab, and then Judah and Israel. And I think, remember, we think the prophets, right, like first gave their prophecies orally, and then they're later written down. And you can imagine a crowd of Judahites when they're like, there's a prophecy against Damascus, like being like, yeah, like stick it to Damascus. And then it's Gaza, stick it to Gaza, and Tyre, those terrible people. And then finally the prophecies come around to them, like they're not left out.
Right.
And so I think it's a way of rhetorical art, right? You get your crowd all foamed up and they're really excited, and then they realize that they are actually the punchline to the whole thing.
It's really interesting because the way that we've seen many of these books composed prior to this, the things against the other nations, if they're going to include both against the other nations and against Israel, the other nation ones tend to be in the middle or towards the end, not right up front as often.
There also tends to be a significant message of hope from a lot of the prophets when it regards Israel's punishment or Judah's punishment. And one of the interesting things about Amos is really uniquely known as a prophet of doom. So as Rick mentioned, chapters 1 and 2, there's all these judgments of the nations which culminate in Judah and Israel. And then 3 through 6, there's all of these short kind of prophetic sayings of Amos about the people's wealth, the way they're oppressing the poor, they're selling them into debt slavery. There's a famous line that talks about they sell them even for a pair of sandals, Amos 2:6, right? Like it's really quite stark, the reality. And then in chapters 7 and 8, we get some visions of Amos and Amos's encounter with Amaziah. Amaziah is the priest in charge of the altar, the worship space in Bethel. And then a lot of scholars will say that Amos 9, which is there's doom, and then you get to Amos 9, and there's a little bit of hope, there's a little bit of comfort. And a lot of people think that this was likely added on in a later period, which I think is just really interesting.
I didn't know
that by and large, like, there is not much hope in Amos. Amos is very famous for reversing the traditional understanding of the day when it comes to the day of the Lord. So we saw the day of the Lord in Joel, and in Amos 5:18, let me flip to it here in my Bible. So in Amos 5:18, he says, "Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord." And remember, in Israel and Judah at the time, the day of the Lord was a time, and we saw this in Joel, and we've seen it elsewhere, in Isaiah and some of the other prophets in Ezekiel, we see reference to it. It's a day when the Lord is going to vindicate Israel over the nations. A lot of ways that it's explicated, it is a time when the nations will be defeated. Sometimes it's also like the nations will be brought in. And then in Amos, it's really like, oh, you think you're going to desire the day of the Lord? Just you wait. This is actually going to be, as you said, Rick, you're the punchline. This is going to be a punishment for you. And then Amos says, you think you want the day of the Lord? This is 5:18. The day of the Lord is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear.
Oh my God.
Again, in verse 20, it is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it. This would have been extremely shocking for the listeners of Amos's day.
So he reverses that, the concept of the day of the Lord. He also reverses what's understood as worship. And so right after the next verse, I have rejected your festivals. I don't savor your assemblies. This is verse 22, even when you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I shall not accept them. So now we're talking like you have all these religious festivals, you're going to church every Sunday, you're putting checks in the plate, you're like reading your Bible, you're doing all the things like quote unquote you religiously should be doing.
Right.
And he's like, no, because you have forgotten the core part of what it means to be a person of God. And then we see in verse 8, this is the other thing that Amos is really known for, being a quote unquote social justice prophet. Like the things that really work him up are how the poor are treated, how the people that are most vulnerable are treated. So this is chapter 8, verse 4. Listen to this, you who trample the needy person, who make the humble people in the country cease. And then he goes into like economic practices that preyed upon those who were poor. So this is the middle of verse 5. Making the barrel measure small, but the shekel big, falsifying the scales by deceit, acquiring the poor people for silver, the needy person for a pair of boots, and selling sweepings as grain. So all these dishonest things that people were doing in society to line their own pockets and to basically rob other people of the money that's in theirs. And God's like, because of like you're doing all this stuff, don't bring me your festival when you're doing this.
Right.
Like don't come with all your like offerings and like make yourself out to be this great person, because at your core you are dishonest and you are not helping those who are vulnerable.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's really a powerful message in Amos. This
Yeah,
message
I mean,
against those who are trampling the poor.
And it's a good thing that today we don't have dishonesty in commerce
right.
or in any other aspect
Certainly
of
not
our
people
life.
putting fillers into our food or anything
Right.
like that. It's not a thing. Right?
Yeah.
I'm surprised that you skipped right over
Uh-oh.
the piece of Amos that MLK is most known for
Oh.
reciting.
Well, hit
right
us.
there in 5. But let justice
Oh.
roll down like waters and righteousness like a never-flowing stream. It was like
Right.
the next verse after the piece that you read.
You are right.
Famously used by
Famously.
Martin Luther King.
It's on his
Yep.
tomb.
Yep.
His tomb's in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the King Center, and and there's
I
actually
think isn't it on the memorial in Washington, D.C. as well?
I'm sure it is. But at his tomb, which is right down the street from the church that he was the pastor of, there's a literal fountain that flows water down from it. It's good.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention with that verse, and this will also connect us to Micah, is that word justice. So this goes all the way back to Isaiah when we started the prophets, and we had the Reverend Tanya Regley on. Go back and listen to those 2 podcasts. They're great. She talked about how the Hebrew words used throughout the prophets really give this connotation of social justice. Hebrew didn't really have this wording the way English does, but the 2 words paired together there, justice and righteousness, are mishpat and zedekah. And in the Hebrew way of thinking, in Amos's proclamation, this justice, this mishpat, it is a concern with society. It is a concern with the practices, as you already highlighted, Rick, that are dishonest, deceitful, unjust, trampling people, swindling them out of money. A big thing in Amos's day against the law of God was debt slavery, right?
Yeah.
As we saw in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, there is a system for slaves to be released. This certainly wasn't being followed in Amos's day.
Nope.
If it was ever followed, as you talk about in that episode, Rick, I remember. So this connects as well to Micah, though. Micah 6:8, right? What is the one? People love this verse. What is required of you? To do justice.
Love kindness.
And walk humbly,
Walk humbly with your God.
I have it on I love it. It's one of my favorite, and it's on a little thing in my office.
Yes. So this call to do justice, it is not, you can't separate this from what is meant to be done in society is what I want to point out. And in Amos, you see the way that's paired with righteousness, right? So like you said, Rick, you can do all of the religious, cultic, ritual things that you want, but if it's not paired with mishpat, with justice, then it's not true righteousness.
Yep.
But I think on the flip side of that as well, the calling is that justice, there's a personal component as well. There's that righteousness component, the holiness component. So the 2 are interrelated, our worship and our action. And I think that's a powerful reminder for Christians that I think various Christians have a way of separating these 2 out.
Yeah.
Some people focus more on the justice. Some people focus more on the personal righteousness. And I think they're called to be
They're
interrelated
both.
for Amos.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
One and the same. And so often the one leads to the other. They really support one another.
Yeah. And what we see in the prophets is that there were times that Israel needed to hear one message more than the other. And so the prophets switch to the message that needs to be said. Like they're doing the religious stuff, but they're failing the social stuff. Or
Right.
they're doing the social stuff, but they're missing the religious stuff. And so the prophets hit both. Amos is at a time where, ostensibly everything's going great. The stock market is through the roof, but the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. And it's because of the very simple, devious actions of some. And it's not only seen by God, but it matters to God.
it's a good word. The only other thing I'd say about Amos that might just be nerdy points for people to be aware of is Amos is prophesying. Remember, he's a southern prophet prophesying to the northern kingdom. And one of the really interesting things, to go back to our first Kings reading that you may remember, is Jeroboam sets up places of worship in Dan and Bethel. And you may remember there are the two calves that Jeroboam, two golden calves he has made. He places in both sites. So throughout Amos, you see this focus on Bethel. So for example, in Amos 5, right before we were reading sections from the latter half of that chapter, in Amos 5:5, he says, "But do not seek Bethel and do not enter into Gilgal." And then in verse 6, when he's talking about the judgment, he says, "It will devour Bethel with no one to quench it." And this culminates in a meeting between Amos and Amaziah in Amos 7. And that's a really interesting section of Amos because so often when we learn about these prophets, we learn about it at the very start of the book, right?
Yep.
And then there's not too much biography after the fact.
No.
But Amos 7 has a really interesting moment where Amos and Amaziah are talking to one another. Amos is confronting Amaziah. Amaziah has gone to Jeroboam and has said, "You got to get rid of this Amos guy. He's a real downer."
Yeah.
And
It's not wrong.
And Amos answers Amaziah in verse 14.
Yep.
"I am no prophet nor a prophet's son, but I am a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go prophesy to my people Israel.'" So I just think that's a really interesting passage, this confrontation between the prophet and the priest. You get a little bit more about Amos. There's a big conversation about how did Amos come to be a prophet? What was his socioeconomic status? A lot of people think Amos might have been poor because of his concern for the poor. A lot of people think maybe that's not the case. He's a sheep herder, so to own sheep, you can't really be poor. So an interesting debate for cross connectors to look into, but
Yeah.
some interesting biography in the book of Amos. You don't usually get a lot of biography.
It could be really thin margins, though, being a sheep herder.
Oh,
Yeah, no doubt.
Like running a grocery store or
Yeah.
a restaurant or something.
Right.
Margins are really thin, even if you got to be pretty wealthy, at least to get started in that business.
Yeah,
Right.
so
I don't know.
My one fun fact, sheep herder, you would think that word pops up all the time in the Old Testament, right?
You'd think.
Yeah.
The only time sheep herder comes up is Amos and 2 Kings 3:4. Only twice in the entire Old Testament. One describes Amos here. The other one describes, if you could get this off the top of your head, I think my jaw would hit the floor.
Second Kings.
2 Kings 3:4.
Gosh, I don't know.
And it describes a non-Israelite.
Is it somebody's warrior
It's
that
the
they
most
brought in?
passing reference. It is to Mesha, the king of Moab. He's described as a sheep herder.
That was on the tip of my tongue, man.
I know. I
Right
could
there.
see it forming.
That feels like that was used as an insult in that context.
No,
it wasn't.
It's, again, the point being to own a lot of sheep is a sign of economic
of some economic
status
status,
and wealth,
okay.
which again just makes it really interesting as a part of Amos's biography. Again, because traditional interpretation for a very long time did hold that Amos was poor. Actually, one of the reasons it thinks he was poor is that description, a dresser of sycamore trees. If you're like, what the heck is a dresser of sycamore trees? This was actually something poor folks would do. And what they would do is they would cut the fig before it was ripe, and this would help it to ripen faster. And it was a form of sustenance that poor folks in Israel would use to eat. And so when it describes Amos as a dresser of sycamore trees, a lot of people were like, oh, that means he was a poor person. But what's interesting is I was really getting into Amos's biography.
I can tell. This is
Yeah, this is
incredible.
good.
And what it was saying is when you pair it with Amos as a sheep herder, what was most likely the case is Amos would do this as a form of kind of cattle fodder, as like he would do this to feed his flocks. So that might be why he described himself as that.
Wow. Okay.
But it just gives a lot of interest to why Amos said the things he said. It also makes it really fascinating if he was someone of means who was within that position, recognizing the problems in the society of his day, right? Mm-hmm. While there's certainly a romantic notion to Amos as this kind of poor sycamore dresser who goes and confronts the elites, I think it's just as powerful, if not maybe more powerful, to see him as someone from within that was able to call for change and reform, radical reform, right? So, and that really says something today for listeners and people that exist within an exorbitantly wealthy society, a stratified society, of what does true courage within society look like, even as someone that may have benefited from it. And we don't know how much Amos benefited from it. As you said, Natalie, maybe margins were tight, but you know, as someone that he's confronting religious leaders in Amaziah, he's confronting kings.
Yeah, that takes a lot. And him being someone of means himself, it does make it easier for him to get into the position to speak to some of these people.
Exactly.
And
he's
that's
got a leg up on that.
It's like one of those things where like you have a platform, you have the audience, you're at the table, use that privilege of being at the table, having that privilege to lift up those who need it. So that's an example of that here.
Well, so maybe we turn to Micah for the sake of time.
Yeah, so we can turn to Micah. As we said, Micah's got one of my favorite quotes in it. Micah also has in it a quote that you might have heard in the lyrics of a song from Hamilton the Musical.
Hit us.
So in One Last Time, which is the song where Washington is telling Hamilton that he is not going to run for another term as president, but he's going to step down and allow the nation to figure out how to run itself. He's also talking about, he quotes Micah 4:4, but they shall all sit under their own vines and their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. And in the song, he says it specifically. Hold on. I just had these lyrics pulled up and then my phone went down.
There's a lot of talk about fig trees here. Like, I feel like we need like someone that has fig trees and harvests figs to come in and speak to us about this, the spirituality of figs.
I can't do this because you're not going to listen to it till next week. If you came to the fair and you visited our booth, you may have found a surprise.
Oh, okay.
So in the lyrics of One Last Time, Washington says, if I say goodbye, the nation learns to move on. Well, he sings this, and I'm not singing it quite the way he would sing it. If I say goodbye, the nation learns to move on. It outlives me when I'm gone. Like the scripture says, everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. They'll be safe in the nation we've made. I want to sit under my own vine and fig tree, a moment alone in the shade. At home in this nation we've made. One last time.
I knew you had to sing something.
I had to sing part of it. Anyway, so that comes from Micah 4.
Amazing. Micah is another 8th century prophet. This is really before the northern kingdom has fallen, but while both kingdoms are under pressure, Micah, it's going off what we just said about Amos, is a prophet who rails against both the religious and the social injustice of his days. And we see it right in the beginning. So Micah chapter 1, verse 7, he's talking about Samaria, all its images will be smashed, all of its gifts burned in fire, all its idols I shall make into desolation. So it's talking about idolatry there. And then you switch over to the beginning of chapter 2. They desire fields and steal them, houses and take them. They defraud a man and his household, an individual in his domain. So it's like more of these practices that people were doing that a few were benefiting from, but the vast majority weren't. And so social injustice. And so Micah sees both things happening in his time, and he speaks against both of them. And we've already referenced it. So if that's what religion doesn't look like, what For Micah, what religion does look like is from Micah chapter 6:8, which hangs on Natalie's wall. What does the Lord require of you? And that'd be an interesting question. Like if you went around and we went around the fair or down the bustling streets of Wayne, Pennsylvania, and said, what does the Lord require of you? And be happy to let people answer that question. Micah's answer is to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's the core of faith.
You might get some choir members, depending on what anthems they've sung. I have in my head, yet again, another song that starts with Micah 6:6, with what shall I come before the Lord? I'm about to sing it again.
Yeah.
But no, anyways, maybe I won't. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams?
So, interesting historical point about Micah. Just like Amos, some callbacks to other areas of the scriptures. Micah is referenced in Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Anyone remember this reference? And it's a really interesting story that you don't see in the book of Micah. So Jeremiah, this is, I believe, let me double check, Jeremiah 26, around verse 18. And it says, Micah of Moresheth, which is the same Micah here in Micah 1:1. Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. He told all the people of Judah, this is what the Lord Almighty says. And it gives a quote from Micah, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become like a heap of rubble. So it's this warning of destruction for their sinfulness, their lack of justice. And in 19 it says, did Hezekiah, king of Judah, or anyone else in Judah put him to death? ? Did not Hezekiah fear the Lord and seek his favor? And did not the Lord relent, so that he did not bring the disaster he pronounced against them? We're about to bring a terrible disaster on ourselves, is what Hezekiah said.
Right.
So really interesting.
Because they didn't kill Micah, that's why they didn't take that out on Jeremiah.
And that they repented under Hezekiah. And this goes back to our Kings episodes and our Chronicles episodes. But Hezekiah was a real reformer, right? He was one of the kings that didn't do evil in the sight of the Lord, as we fondly remember, I'm sure, from Kings.
The one who might have been even better than Josiah.
Right, like those two
right
were
up
neck
there,
and neck for the closest after David. So just an interesting note about Micah. In some sense, according to Jeremiah, he was a pretty successful prophet.
Didn't Amos also not get killed? And there's a reference about Amos, and is that in Isaiah?
There might be one reference to Amos. I can't remember. What's interesting, though, is that with Micah, unlike Amos, Micah is a little bit later. And remember, Israel, with its capital Samaria, falls in 722. So during the time of Micah. And so part of what Jeremiah is reporting is that it was, if you remember, thanks to Micah, that the southern kingdom, Judah, doesn't fall. Because under Hezekiah, they're like, oh gosh, we see what's happening with Israel, our northern sibling, and we're going to do differently.
Right. For a while.
Yeah, not long. Not even 200 years, 150 years.
Yep.
And even then, an unstable 150 years, as we've seen in some of those major prophets and the things that took place. But
Goodness.
Yeah, interesting historical point on Micah. I think one of my favorite lines from Micah that maybe doesn't get quoted quite as much is Micah 3:5. And this is when Micah says, thus says the Lord concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who cry, so these other prophets cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against those who put nothing into their mouths. That is such a heavy metal line.
Yeah.
Like, you've got something
I listened to that
eat.
a couple of times. I was like, I went back and went over that one again.
Everything's fine for you.
Right. You want to talk about justice in society? Look at the people in charge. And are they saying everything's hunky-dory when they're putting food in their mouths? And are they are what they're doing declaring war on the people who have no food in their mouths?
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a good litmus test for whether justice is being done according to Micah. So I love it. To me, it helps contextualize Micah 6:8 when he says, this is what the Lord requires, do justice. Well, the question is, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. And for Micah, it's very material. You read, Rick, I think from Micah 2. To me, Micah 3 is also really graphic. Again, I said heavy metal. Micah 3 says in verse 1, should you not know justice, right? So there's, again, that idea of justice being something that needs to be done. And this is verse 2-3, which is just
wow, this is incredible. Yeah.
You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces. and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron. Wow. Yeesh.
Wow.
But again, it's showing the way that justice is not an abstract concept. Justice is a material concept connected to both the real lived suffering, economically, materially, with food of people versus prosperity. Right?
Well, and the real pain that hunger and injustice actually causes. We're not talking about actual cannibalism here.
Right,
They're
right.
No, it's not literal.
But it's
in that
as
way.
if they are churning them up and they are spitting them out.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is anathema to God.
Yeah.
And you can't separate the actions that you're taking that cause these things to happen.
Right.
Then the next verse, speaking of those people who do those things, they will cry out to Yahweh. He will not answer them.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have stepped outside of Yahweh's purview. Don't bother calling.
Yeah. Harsh.
Metal.
Yeah. Harsh. So Micah has a little bit more hope than Amos, probably originally. And Micah famously says that this hope will come from, drum roll. You remember where it comes from for Micah?
Oh, the one who...
I'm quizzing you guys.
Wait, hold on. There's
Oh, little town of Bethlehem.
Yep. So Micah is very unique in that he is the one, I think uniquely, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think uniquely, he is the one who locates the coming hope in Bethlehem.
Yep.
And interestingly enough, he says, this is Micah 5:2 for anyone that wants to go look it up. But you, O Bethlehem, you are the one of the little tribes of Judah. From you shall come forth for me the one who is to rule in Israel. So,
Which in his day, everyone would have read as a Davidic commentary. Like
Right.
a new king in the Davidic line
Right.
is going to emerge.
right.
Once Jesus comes on the scene, Christians look back on this and say, wait, we're not just looking for an earthly king, but what Micah was talking about was Jesus,
Yep.
Messiah,
Yep.
Son of God.
Yep.
Thank you for it.
shall
I
feed
almost
his flock.
I know.
I was
It's
ready
a-
to move
I know,
on
It's been
I
a
from
long
know,
day.
I
You
had
can't
noted
forget
this
that.
section, but I forgot that it started up there.
Can't forget that.
I was looking at the...
Maybe the last thing, unless anyone else has one, my one last thing about Micah that I think Micah's well remembered for is the line from Micah 4. And this is when Micah's, again, propounding this hope. So Micah chapter 4 starts with, in the days to come. So these are the days after the exile, after judgment. He talks about how Zion and Jerusalem will get back its glory and the nations will stream to it, many peoples. And then in verse 3 of chapter 4, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So again, this hope, and I think that's a powerful message, and it's a powerful message that's been used in contemporary day.
Yeah.
We probably have mostly Episcopalian listeners, but if any of them come from Catholic backgrounds, they may be familiar with the Plowshares movement.
Yeah.
And the Plowshares movement was a Catholic worker movement that started in the 60s and was really outspoken against the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
against nuclear weapons.
proliferation.
Yep. They burned draft cards. They actually went to jail for going into a facility that produces nuclear weapons and putting pig's blood on the facility. So again, really trying to put into practice, what does it mean to beat those swords into plowshares and believe that in a world that is still pretty violent.
Yep.
Well, and there are Episcopal ministries today that do that, not so much swords, but they take guns and they turn them into farm equipment. I believe up in Connecticut.
Cool.
There's also some
And
pretty
I think,
stunning pieces of art that have taken weapons of war and turned them into artistic representations of plows.
Right.
notable, so I had told you all earlier that the quote in Hamilton is from just after this.
Yep.
So it's an interesting thing that Lin-Manuel Miranda did there, taking this quote and putting it into Washington's mouth as the War of the American Revolution is over. The new nation is starting. He's referring to a time of peace following putting down weapons of war. Right. So that's an interesting little.
That is very interesting.
Art and prophecy.
Hand in hand. So move on to...
What's there to say about Obadiah? Obadiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Scriptures.
21 verses.
It's mainly a pronouncing judgment on the nation of Edom. If you remember this, way back in the Genesis, we have Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name gets changed into Israel. Esau's name gets changed to Edom. And so they are two figures who then become two figureheads of two nations. Edom is just on the other side of the Dead Sea from Israel. And
Edom keeps coming up throughout. Like, we keep hearing about
Right,
Edom
yeah.
and all these things against Edom.
if you remember, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, because you remember back in the days of Genesis, there was
That's what I was gonna
lots
say.
of trouble between these two brothers, and that trouble just keeps playing out. Like they never quite.
And I think we
back.
talked about this in a previous episode.
I might have only been just last week or the week before.
There's some moment where they're entering the promised land
And Edom doesn't help them out.
It's
Yes.
They
Edom.
ask for a little help, and Edom's, no, I'm not going to do it. There's
Yeah,
a couple
Moses is leading them in through, and they have to go around the long.
and there's a
because-
couple nations that do that to them. It's either 2 or 3 nations. They keep needing a little help, and the nation's like, no. And for the rest of the Bible, the Bible does not forget that
Right.
over and
No.
over again. You did not help us back then, and so judgment is coming.
elephant with a memory that just
Yes.
doesn't stop.
And this came up in Amos as well, actually. So in those judgments against the nations, Amos talks about Edom.
Yep.
And you'll notice the phrasing. This is Amos 1, verse 11 and 12. Because he, Edom, pursued his brother, a.k.a. Judah and Israel, with the sword and cast off all pity. He, Edom, maintained his anger perpetually and kept his wrath forever.
Yep.
So part of the judgment goes back even to that situation and back to Jacob and Esau, where it's like, well, they started it. But Obadiah, the context is a little bit something
it's-
recent that happened.
Right. So it's after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, and Edom cheered Babylon on,
Yeah.
but also apparently helped maybe in some of the ransacking or taking some of the loot. And so that's what this is about. Their part in the Babylonian destruction.
I feel
Right.
like we did talk about this either in when we went through Jeremiah or Ezekiel, since those were both written in I think it was probably Jeremiah. Edom came up in this way, and we talked about that Edom had helped with that situation.
So to Rick's point about the Babylonian destruction, so again, we've jumped on the timeline. We're around 586 BCE, the fall of Jerusalem and Judah and the exile into Babylon. And this is what Obadiah verse 10 says. For the slaughter and violence done to your brother Jacob in the destruction of Jerusalem, shame shall cover you, Edom, and you shall be cut off forever. On that day, the day of the destruction of Jerusalem, proverbially, that you stood aside, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were like one of them. But you should not have gloated over your brother on the day of his misfortune. You should not have rejoiced over the people of Judah on the day of their ruin. You should not have boasted on the day of distress. So really, Obadiah is like one long argument, hate letter from one family member to another family member.
So in verse 14,
Right.
it gets even worse. You shouldn't have stood at the crossroad to cut down the escapees. You shouldn't have handed over the survivors on the day of pressure. So they aren't just watching from afar and like laughing and slapping their knees. They're when Judah is at its most vulnerable, they are striking at them.
So I think as I was reading Obadiah, I was struck by the question, because I ask this question with every book, because I think it helps you understand the book, is why is this book in the Bible?
Yeah.
This 21 verse book, why is it in the Bible? And I don't know if y'all want to give your thoughts on that. Maybe the listener's like, yeah, why would I even care about Obadiah?
Yeah, so there's an interesting play on Edom. Linguistically, it is related. Edom is related to the word Adam, same root, the D and the M, and so Edom and Adam. And so scholars talk about this book not just being against one nation, but against all nations that that enact the sin
Right.
of pride, and there's where it speaks right to us
Yeah,
today,
definitely.
right? Like it's not just about, oh, this nation that did a couple bad things like thousands of years ago, but it's about nations that out of their pride and lack of compassion fail to help humanity.
Those in need.
Yeah. It definitely gives that impression of you were watching as someone else was harmed. You
Right.
might have even just taken advantage of the opportunity to also do a little bit of harm.
Yep.
Or, oh, well, they escaped. They ran away and they weren't supposed to. And this other country said, I have to send them back. Well, I'm sending them back, knowing that you're sending people back into danger.
Yep.
Or harming them. It's a lack of lack of compassion for people outside of your own nation. And God has made it clear throughout our scriptures that God cares not just for Israel, Judah, but also for those of other nations.
It goes back to the original blessing that was conveyed upon Abraham,
yeah.
that he would be a blessing to the nations, for the nation. All nations will be blessed through you.
Right.
And so when we do our part in making sure the peoples of the world are blessed, then we are aligned with God. When we don't, we step out.
Yeah, when we turn our
of
back, when
alignment
we
with
know that other people are being harmed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk
So-
about international policy
Yeah.
in Obadiah.
Yeah, I think part of the answer here too is not only social but personal. I think Obadiah gives really strong voice to feelings of betrayal, and especially with that family dynamic, the language of Edom as brother, right?
Oh,
I think
yeah.
today, not to over personalize it or over spiritualize it, I think everything we said socially is really important, but also on the personal level, right? Like, how do we handle those feelings of betrayal? And I almost think of Obadiah like imprecatory psalm. When we talked about those psalms.
Yeah.
It's less about like, yeah, we should dash babies against the rocks, which happens in the imprecatory psalms. And I think here as well, like there's quite a bit of judgment on Edom, right? Like basically being like, God hates you and will cast you off and never show his face to you. And I think that gives voice to how we often feel when we're betrayed. And that gets recontextualized in other areas of our scriptures, right? Just like the imprecatory psalms do. We don't take the imprecatory psalms literally. So I think Obadiah is really up to something similar.
Yeah.
And I've certainly talked to my fair share of people who, and I understand it myself, have dealt with significant family challenges, right? Situations that can be really hard.
Yeah. And goes back to my whole thing about the imprecatory psalms, that it's important that they're in there because they're real feelings.
Right.
And
Exactly.
we don't have to just talk to God as if God is our Victorian grandmother.
Right.
We can share everything with God, even our feelings of jealousy and hatred.
Right.
And
So-
yeah, if God can be upset and jealous, as we saw in Hosea,
yeah.
right? Then certainly God can handle it if we are.
Yeah. So Obadiah has a pretty negative view of this foreign country, Edom. Not the nicest, but we get a bit of an alternative in Jonah.
But before we do, I mean, there's also Nahum.
Yeah.
So,
So this is where we turn to Natalie, who wants to say some things about Nahum.
Yeah.
I don't want to say much about Nahum, just that Nahum is small for a book. It's a short book. And Nahum and Jonah both concern Nineveh, which is the capital city of Assyria, which we are all aware, hopefully, if we've listened for all this time, that Assyria defeated Israel and all. So, of course, this is a place that you would not think good things about if you were an Israelite, a Judahite. And Nahum does take that very negative stance against Nineveh.
It's a celebration of Assyria's destruction. He's pretty psyched.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's really mostly what I wanted to say about Nahum,
Oh.
is that Nahum is like the Obadiah, but towards Nineveh,
Right.
which we then see in Jonah.
And Jonah. I think the cross connectors just need to know that when Elliot and I were preparing for today, Elliot and I completely blanked
Yeah.
on preparing for Nahum. And it was Natalie who reminded us. That's why we thought that Natalie might have some things to say.
Natalie's
'Cause
our Nahum referencer today.
I could read to you the little notes in my book about when this takes place and all of that, but
We got it.
I think,
we
yeah.
get,
you
we
hit
get the most important parts of that. And it's an interesting thing to hold Nahum up against Jonah
Yeah.
for how they each deal differently
Yes.
with Nineveh.
And one thing we'll see is very different endings to the book. The one thing I'll say about Nahum, much like Obadiah in its view of its neighbors, its foreign countries, Nahum ends in verse 19 with, "There is no assuaging your hurt, your wound is mortal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you." basically saying,
Who has ever escaped your endless cruelty?
yeah, basically saying everyone should cheer over your suffering and destruction.
Again, imprecatory wise, you understand where Nahum is coming from. Similarly to Obadiah, there's a lot of pain. The Assyrians were not great when they came in and took over. So
Not great.
Yeah,
That's very good.
They were really not
They were
great.
not great.
That's a technical term.
That's a technical term.
Which brings us to Jonah.
Which brings us to Jonah, which is also, I'd forgotten how short this book was.
It's 4 short chapters.
But it reigns so large in my
It does,
imagination.
'cause it's got a great story.
To Sunday school.
And it's got a great story, and Sunday school and a million vacation Bible schools have been launched on the first chapter of Jonah.
Yeah, like really only the very beginning.
And you can just tell my energy level has just increased a lot because I get
The
really...
first 2 chapters, we'll say. It's the first two chapters of Jonah, but...
I get really passionate about this, that we turn Jonah into this cute little kid story. Mm-hmm. And we focus on Jonah and the whale, which wasn't a whale, it was a large fish. And then there's like all this religious commentary. Was he actually swallowed by a whale? And so people were like, no, he wasn't. You couldn't be survived.
Was it a whale or was it a big fish?
Right. And then someone else says, well, there was some fisherman who in 1985 fell into a whale and survived. So it must... All of that is smokescreen for one of the most important messages of the entire Bible. Because this is not a book about a whale or a fish. This is a book about mercy.
Right.
And how God's mercy is wide and humanity's mercy is very narrow.
Yeah.
It was so surprising to read this again and be like, this is not how I remembered this story.
Is it because you got to chapters 3 and 4? Or
Well, partly because I got to chapters 3 and 4, yes. Oh, there's more to the story.
Yeah.
The way our collective consciousness seems to have remembered Jonah, and this is, again, it's largely...
right.
God love children's ministry people. Just God love them. But our interaction with Jonah is largely from only that perspective. And we get a very quick wash of what even happens in the first 2 chapters. You get that Jonah's called by God to go to Nineveh. He doesn't like anybody in Nineveh. You don't really understand why he doesn't like the people of Nineveh because there's no context. It's a kid's story, right?
Right.
He runs away. You don't even get like a good picture of actually what happens on the boat and how they go about trying to determine what to do with him before he gets tossed overboard. You just get, he's on a boat. It's stormy. They toss him overboard because he says, oh, it's my fault. He doesn't even admit to it being his fault necessarily very quickly. He has one of those Jesus moments where he's asleep during the storm, although I would not compare Jonah to Jesus otherwise.
Yeah, Jonah shows up in the Gospels a couple times, just specifically to say.
And then so he does end up in Nineveh, but he continues to be begrudging about bringing a message to them.
Oh, the whole time he goes kicking and screaming.
Yeah, he does what he's been asked for. So similarly to what our impression of Amos, he doesn't seem to be a prophet or anybody who's assigned to do this, except that God just calls him to do this one task.
Yeah.
So
can I backtrack and say just a few things about the history of the book and the structure of the book?
Yeah.
So Jonah is unique among all of the prophetic literature, major and minor prophets, as being the only work in those sections that is not the recordings of what the prophet said.
Right.
So this is a story about a prophet. So that's a key distinction. An interesting note about the story that you both have hit on, and your point, Natalie, with children's understandings of the story, it's really just the story of chapters 1 and 2 in a lot of ways of like, so Jonah was supposed to go to Nineveh. He flees. He's on a boat. He gets thrown into the sea. The whale spits him up and he goes to Nineveh. But really and it's a fish, not a whale. But really the book is structured as 2 stories. So chapters 1 and 2 and chapters 3 and 4 are basically 2 stories. And what's interesting about these literarily is that they have an identical structure. So Jonah's supposed to go do something. He doesn't want to do it. He prays. God responds. And then the people in the story who are non-Israelites have a positive response to God. So in the first story of chapters 1 and 2, it's the sailors and the captain. And then in the second story of chapters 3 and 4, it's the king of Nineveh and the people of Nineveh.
And the sailors having a positive interaction with God that gets completely missed
yes.
and glossed over when you
course.
do the children's story
and I'm
versions
so
of this.
glad you said that, because it is actually exactly this parallelism of structure that shows how important the sailors and the captain on the boat are. Like, this is not just a kind of background detail of the story. This is a pivotal part of the story that's essential to its message. In fact, what's really interesting, we can get into this more. So the sailors and the captain and the king and the people of Nineveh both use the language for God of Elohim. This is going to go way back to the early parts of the Old Testament when we talked about how pivotal these names of God are for these different segments of the Old Testament.
Yeah, we hear Yahweh a lot.
Yes.
And Elohim is one that we haven't heard in a while.
So interestingly, the people of Nineveh and the king only use Elohim, which is really just this general term for God. Again, remember, Yahweh is the personal name for the God of Israel that's revealed in Moses, in Exodus. And what's interesting is it's only the captain and the sailors who use the name Yahweh. The people of Nineveh and the king do not use the name Yahweh, which is really interesting.
As
That is
many years as I
interesting.
studied this book, I have never noticed that.
Yep, which again tells you something really important about how crucial the sailors and the captain are to this story.
Yep.
So
because they knew Jonah's God. When Jonah does come clean and explain what's going on, they're like, whoa, we know that God.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Right. So the one thing I wanted to say about the history of this book, and to your point, Rick, about the way it becomes this story about a whale, and you even reference it with the modern era of people being like, well, there's this fisher, that it becomes this book that gets really tied up in apologetic debates.
Yes.
Of like, could Jonah have really survived in a whale? Blah, 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 blah. And I think the interesting thing about Jonah is that before the modern era, it was just assumed that this was a true story. And then I think what's interesting is as we begin to know a little bit more about Hebrew and a little bit more about the history of this book, a few things. Interestingly, I think Jonah is chosen for this book because there is a reference. This goes back to some of our other prophets and references elsewhere. There is a reference of Jonah in 2 Kings 14:25. So there's this prophet Jonah, and it doesn't say a single thing about him. And what's interesting is this book, I think most scholars would now say, is doing what a lot of works in the ancient world did, which is choosing someone from the known history to help substantiate the book as like, here's this person. The other thing I wanted to say is in terms of when this book was written, it's probably the latest of everything we have here, probably the Second Temple period. So one of the reasons we know this, which I just think is fascinating, is in Jonah 1:9. When Jonah talks about God, Jonah says, I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. And this way of talking about God is not used at all until the Second Temple period. Yep. So again, I think the interesting point of all of that is it clues us in to this book is a story. It's not meant to be a recounting of some sort of historical event that took place.
It's not the point.
It's not the point.
No.
Completely
it's more like
misses
a parable.
the point. That's exactly right. It's more like a parable.
And it's a parable of satire or caricature.
Yes.
So Jonah in this ends, like in the lines of the story, ends up being the most successful prophet of the entire Old Testament.
Right.
He converts an entire city, an entire pagan city,
right,
to repent of their sins and follow Yahweh. Is there another prophet of the Old Testament who's even close? Like most of them got thrown down cisterns or driven out of town. This guy is amazing.
Which, despite being really
going,
unhappy with the job.
Kicking and screaming. So this is my thing. So God tells him to go. He gets on a boat, goes in the opposite direction. When the storm comes, the sailors are throwing the cargo overboard. He's like, throw me overboard.
Right.
He doesn't say, oh, we can save everybody if you just turn the boat around and start going to Nineveh where God's, no, throw me. Like he doesn't want to go. He'd rather die than go. Then he gets spit up on the shores of Nineveh after 3 days in a whale. The author of the book tells us that Nineveh was a 3-day walk across, and Jonah goes 1 day's journey in. So he's not in the middle. He's not in the center of Nineveh. And it's there he says, 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown. I think in the Hebrew, I think it's 4 words. And out of that, the whole city repents and turns to the Lord. It is a total caricature of what a prophet is. And my line on Jonah is that the book of Jonah is not about converting Nineveh. The book of Jonah is about converting Jonah, because Jonah cannot figure out the mercy of God, who says, I will forgive the Ninevites if they but turn to me. And Jonah's like, nope. I would rather be thrown overboard in the midst of a storm than have that happen.
I'd rather die under this tree.
He's so into the same hatred of Nineveh that Nahum has that he would rather do anything. So, and then the second part of the story is just as good, because he's outside the city. He's just wallowing in pity because God's had mercy on them. God gives him that little tree who pops up and gives him some shade. And Jonah just loves his tree so much. And he just sits under the shade and enjoys it like George Washington under the shade of the fig tree.
Exactly.
And then overnight, God provides a worm who eats the tree. And then Jonah wails. Jonah.
No pun intended.
I really did not mean that. Okay. Jonah.
That's amazing. Well done.
That's been a long day. Jonah is just like apoplectic over the loss of this tree. And God's, you care more about this stupid tree that came up one day and is gone the next than you do about all the souls that live in Nineveh.
Yeah.
And this is where I think Jonah is a story that's probably written 2,500 years ago, 2,400 years ago. And yet it could have been written today, because we are all Jonah who love to condemn other people and can't imagine those people who we want to condemn receiving the mercy of God.
Yep.
Yeah. And it shows, again, God cares for even those who were not.
We can't even,
can't.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I had in seminary, would frequently say, when we get to heaven, we will be surprised at who is there. We're going to like, wait, how you got in? You weren't supposed to get in, because if we were in charge, those people wouldn't get in, but we're not in charge. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. So I think a few things of parallels with Jonah in the New Testament. The New Testament authors love the end of Jonah 1. That Jonah is in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah is really one of the most significant stories for Christian iconography in the early church. In fact, this Jonah and whales would be used on burial tombs in the early church, which is fascinating. I'm sure our Cross Connector listeners can go look up some pictures. I think there's some stuff online you could find.
It's one of the ways that the fish becomes the symbol of Christianity in the earliest days.
Because of Jonah?
Yeah.
I thought it was just because so many of the disciples were fishermen.
I mean, that too.
And all of the
that too.
Go fish for people.
That too. But yeah.
I didn't realize it went all the way back to Jonah.
Yep.
Very interesting.
So I think the other really interesting connection based on what you were just talking about, Rick, in terms of our own hard-heartedness and our lack of mercy for others, and the way that, I'll make a bit of a bold claim, this can often be a uniquely religious sentiment. I think people of religious faiths can often be the worst in terms of ostracizing those that are different from them, of condemning them, of judging them. I think there's a connection between this story of Jonah and the story in Luke 9 of the disciples trying to call down fire on a Samaritan village. And I think these stories are great reminders, especially as we've been moving through the pages of the Old Testament, and we are seeing a lot of judgment on nations, the way that this gets reconfigured.
Yeah.
And so in Luke 9, for anyone that wants to go look this story up, it's Luke 9. It's very short, Luke 9, 51 to 56. So they're going towards Jerusalem, and Jesus sends out messengers who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him. So they were worse than the Ninevites. They did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. And the disciples, James and John, saw this, and they said, you can just hear it. You can just hear someone saying this, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them. and they went to another village.
This is one of those moments where Jesus facepalm.
Yeah.
I think before he rebuked them, he was like, "Are you
Right.
fucking kidding me?"
Right.
He's like, hey, guys, it's time to take a walk. We're moving on.
Did you guys miss all the love your neighbor and
Yeah,
love your
right.
enemy stuff? Have you heard a word I said? Apparently not.
Did I stutter?
Yeah.
Kind of
Oh
thing.
my gosh. And we are James and John who do that all the
Exactly.
time. There are people we would all like to cast fire down or have God righteously cast fire down from heaven upon.
Right.
And that's only because we have a very narrow understanding of what mercy is.
Absolutely.
And we turn away when whole groups of people
Yeah.
without any
Yeah.
distinction.
Right.
Well, not quite. It tracks the story about Jonah. So in modern day Iraq, there's the city of Mosul, which was the ancient city of Nineveh. And in Mosul, for centuries and centuries, I don't even know how old it is, 7th century, maybe, there has been a shrine to Jonah. It was a shrine that was revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Yeah.
Because all three Abrahamic religions recognize Jonah as a prophet. For a while, apparently, over what was supposed to be the tomb of Jonah, there was the skeleton of a whale, as if it was his whale. And so I love that it was like Jonah, this prophet of mercy, this prophet who shows that God even includes the Ninevites, right? Like ends up being this prophet who brings three religions together, three religions that tend to do a lot of infighting. Now, here's where the story takes a turn. In 2014, with the rise of ISIS in Iraq,
Destroyed.
ISIS blew up the tomb. Yeah, it's like the perfect, just shows,
Well,
what
you can just, it's
humanity
like,
does. Like we can't.
Well, and on a large scale, the three religions don't really do a good job getting along all the time.
Little silver lining, when they blew it up, they left. But an archaeologist came back like, oh, I can't believe this happened.
So many wonderful things have gotten destroyed.
But then, because it got blown up, they ended up finding a 7th century BC Assyrian palace underneath of it. And so, like, this archaeological treasure they didn't even know existed was discovered. So a little bit of a silver lining.
Because they couldn't dig because it was a shrine.
Because that couldn't dig because it's a shrine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No kidding. I had never heard that.
Look at that revealing.
Yeah. Little apocalypsis.
That's a little apocalypse. I thought it was interesting. There's a note in here in Jonah, chapter 3, verse 8, makes note of animals being covered in sackcloth.
Yeah.
And the notes in the study Bible indicate that this was a way of including all of God's creation, including like animals, into this promise as well. And I know that's a few times have been brought up that so often we forget that it's not just humanity that's part of God's promises. It's all of creation.
Goes back to the covenant with Noah that God makes with all creation.
All creation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Part of it, too, is also just like the irony and sarcasm throughout Jonah. This is a very humorous book.
Yeah.
So to be like the king being like, even the animals need to put on sackcloths, right? Like,
yes.
Part of it is, again, throwing into Jonah's face. Jonah didn't even say repent. In fact, and that's an important part of the story.
40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown.
Jonah did not proclaim repentance. And so again, part of the irony of this interaction is it is the king of Nineveh who enacts the Deuteronomistic theology of if we repent, God will relent. And one of the things I love, I said this in our Esther episode, this doesn't happen often throughout the Bible, but there's this line, and I think it's Mordecai, I believe it's Mordecai who says this in Esther, who says, who knows, maybe you were put here for such a time as this. And I said in that episode that who knows, when it's used there and it's used here by the king of Nineveh. It is actually a Hebrew kind of idiom for saying, who knows, the Lord is merciful. Like it's not actually oh, who knows at all. It's a hopeful expectation of divine mercy and divine providence. So in the mouth of the king of Nineveh, at no prompting of Jonah, is this message of repentance.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's just dripping
And it's this
with
over the
irony.
top repentance.
Over the
like,
top.
Yeah.
Absolute.
Even the animals will repent,
Right.
which is just hilarious to me.
I'm so glad you brought up Esther, because we kept talking about how this story is so over the top. It's clearly, it's a story.
Yeah, I mean, there's no
It's not
record of
history.
Yeah, there's
It's
no
a
record
story.
of an entire city repenting and turning to the
Right.
Lord. Right.
And I'm like,
Right.
oh, it's just like Esther, because Esther was so full of ridiculous caricatures and situations that made no sense.
How tall was the
Scaffold,
Like the
that he was
scaffold, yeah.
going to be
Like the
hanging
gallows.
from.
The
gallows?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know,
it was
like when he
100
throws
feet
himself
high or something like
and
that.
when he throws himself upon her begging for mercy,
Yep.
the king comes back in all upset. So many. So hold Jonah the same way you hold Esther in that sort of a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair recommendation. A funny point about Jonah and then a more serious point. Another I find just insanely, you said Jesus facepalm with the disciples, Rick. I think this is like a God facepalm
Okay.
with Jonah. So in Jonah 4, Jonah's angry, right? Because God at the end of 3 relents from the disaster, which is really great. Again, talk about callbacks of Jonah with other books. In a lot of ways, Jonah is calling back to Genesis and Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. And God
Yeah.
here, unlike the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, changes God's mind.
God relents.
Which is God relents, which is, again, just an interesting development in the tradition. And then in 4, Jonah's just absolutely apoplectic. Like, how could you relent? How could you do this? And he throws in God's face the name of God, the qualities, the attributes of God revealed to Moses.
I knew that you were a God.
And this isn't a positive
mercy.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, it's really out of line. He's saying, I knew you were a God of mercy, slow to anger. And so there's this irony. And then right after he says it, he says, so please just take my life. You are a God of mercy.
You're a God of mercy, and I am not a man of mercy.
Right. Just ridiculous. It really holds a mirror up to all of us, I think, as you've said, Rick, to look into our own hearts.
I'm pretty sure that I'm just realizing that bit about God is God of mercy, slow to anger. That was in one of these other readings this week.
I think last week we talked about
it was
this,
in
the
there.
attributes. I believe it came up in Hosea. It comes up
It
everywhere.
just
This
keeps
is the
coming up.
attributes
Like,
of
this
God.
is the attributes of God.
from
I was
Exodus
pretty sure it was
34.
in these two, but got to make a note of it.
So on the attributes of God as merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, ready to relent from punishing, I think the power of, as you said, Rick, that this is a story not about Nineveh primarily, but about Jonah and the way that all of us can become Jonah if we're not careful. The
Yeah.
book ends with a question. And I think that's really powerful and important to notice. And the question is the question that God poses to Jonah after the bush has died. And God says, should I not be concerned about Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals.
And also many animals.
And also many animals. Again, the exaggeration at play. But to end the book with a question, the question is not just for Jonah. It's for
No,
every
it's
person
for-
that reads this book.
Yeah.
Should I not pity, and then just fill in the blank?
Fill in the blank. Think of the person you want to rain fire down,
Yeah.
Luke 9 style, and then
Yeah.
pose that question to yourself.
Right.
From Jonah chapter 4:11.
I think it's really beautiful the way that God first starts that with, at this point, it's about that tree, that he's all upset about the tree at the moment. And God said, you didn't grow the tree. You didn't tend the tree. You didn't have anything to do with its existence. How are you so wrapped up around it?
Right.
And it's a little bit like, these things are mine. These things, plants, people, animals, they're mine. I created them.
Yep.
I raised them up. I gave them my gifts and made them bountiful and abundant. How dare you be the one to decide?
Do you notice we're a long way away from Jonah, who just goes into the belly of a whale?
Right. Oh, yeah.
We are a long way away from Vacation Bible School.
And we're a long way from the modern concern with, oh, did Jonah really live 3 days in a whale? Let's find a way to prove it.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
You're really missing the point.
Yeah. Elliot and I were talking about this last week a little bit about just what does it mean to form children and youth in the faith. And when we're forming children, it is perfectly appropriate to simplify everything, right?
Right.
Like to to tell the story of Jonah and the whale, to tell the story of this prophet who doesn't want to go here, and God sends a whale and he spends 3 days in the belly, and like it's perfectly appropriate. But then eventually what we need to do is then go back to stories like Jonah and say, okay, now part of it, let's go a little further now, and let's talk about what this story is really about. I think we present a version of the faith and who God is and what the character of God is in very simple ways, and we should when it is age appropriate. But if we don't then follow that up with the beautiful and wondrous complexity that is God and the story of God, we do not do our kids any service. And eventually the simple faith doesn't work anymore. They suffer a personal tragedy, or something happens to them, or something happens in the world. And they're like, wait a minute, I thought God was just like my buddy who rides shotgun and sits on my shoulder, and like every bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. Like what? We have to like take the time to then walk with people as they get a little older and say, this story that you knew about this wonderful character who slides into the belly of a whale is actually about how hard-hearted we can be at times. And you've experienced that hard-heartedness at the hands of other people, and you've experienced hard-heartedness in yourself towards others. Part of what it means to be a faithful person is to realize that hard-heartedness is not supposed to have the last word, but that the mercy and grace of God is.
Yeah.
So how can we infuse our lives more with mercy and grace?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really important point about needing to come back to the stories as we grow. That they have more to offer to us all the time. Going through this now, I'm reading it again going, look at these things I missed before that I'd forgotten.
Yep.
It's really important to come back. It's one of the things that I think is nice about the way being a liturgical church and having a lectionary that rotates on a 3-year basis.
Yeah, you keep coming back to
Coming
stories.
back to the same stories.
They keep meeting you.
Yeah.
You're in a different place, but the story's still there. And
Yeah. I once tried to design I used to do children's formation, and I was trying to work with the person who was doing middle school formation. And we'd had this design like, okay, if you've got kids for this many years, how can you mirror a 3-year? We're going to do these stories these 3 years, and then we're going to come back around and you'll get the stories again 3 years later. And then you'll get the stories again 3 years later.
Wow.
But you'll have changed how you're looking at them each of those 3 years. Because kids start them real young, and you can get them at least through middle school.
Yeah.
You could maybe get that. You could maybe get through 3 cycles with kids before high school.
Right.
And then hopefully you could keep them for high school.
I was in the family service this past week, and the story was Lazarus and the rich man. And so I have a bunch of like 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds in front of me, and I'm telling this story, but I can't go into, and then he died, right? And then he went to hell and was tormented. Like, I can't tell that story in that way to that audience, because like they'd be running, screaming and crying. So I told the part of the story that I could, but hopefully in 3 years, they might have graduated to the later service, and they'll hear Elliot's sermon on the Lazarus and the rich man, and they'll go a little deeper.
Yeah. So keep coming back. There's always new things to learn.
Yeah.
There's always a new perspective to bring to it. As we've said before, the Bible isn't just static texts that don't say new things to us. We bring ourselves to the Bible as much as anything. And so the way that you bring yourself to the Bible this year is going to be different than the way you bring yourself to the Bible in a few years.
Right.
And who you are with and the things that trigger those people's thoughts and recollections, that's also going to trigger new things for you to keep digging deeper.
Good reminder.
From the minor prophets to theory of Christian formation. It's good.
We said they may be called the minor prophets, but they got some major things to offer
That's
to us.
Major offerings.
Good things come in small packages,
Yeah.
as my one daughter says.
So we've got...
Guess which one?
We've got 5 more minor prophets next week. We're going to be
1 episode left.
Habakkuk through Malachi, and we will be finished
The Old
with
Testament.
the Old Testament,
Wow.
the Hebrew Scriptures.
This is big. This is big.
I feel like we need cake.
Yeah.
And a nap.
10 months
A
later.
snack and a nap.
Snack and a nap.
Hey,
All right, I'll bring the cake.
if it's good for one profit. You bring the cake, we'll find a couch somewhere. I don't know
Not
about
anymore.
the
They're all
No,
gone out
no,
of
they're
this
all
room.
gone in here. I think Elaine took it. It's just down the other room.
She did.
Maybe just some pillows. Well, thanks for joining us this week, folks. We'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
and Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.